Hello, and welcome to the Maple Moon podcast. This is your host, Courtney, and it's probably about time that I finally do an episode solely dedicated to one of my favourite writers, Sylvia Plath. Now, I know a lot of people roll their eyes when you say that Sylvia Plath is one of your favourite writers, but she has been for a good number of years. I was first introduced to Plath just before I was about to drop out of sixth form. I was miserable the entire time I did sixth form, back in end of 2013 through 2014. But my second year, which would have started in the September of 2014, was when I dropped out. I think I did one day, only because I was forced to at the time. And then I was allowed to quit. But anyway, so the summer break, just before we broke for the summer, our last lesson was about to start on what was going to be our next module, and we were watching the 2003 film Sylvia with Gwyneth Paltrow and Daniel Craig. And then I obviously learned about Sylvia Plath through that, and just all the talk of death and darkness and gothic and mist and fog just appealed to me so much. Because for years I've been looking for someone who writes the dark stuff. I've always loved the dark stuff. Just very like Victorian London Dickensian sort of darkness. I've just always had a fondness for it, hence why I'm a goth. Um, so when I then went out and purchased Ariel, because I believed at that point I was going to be going back to college. It was only this over the summer that I realised I didn't want to go back. Um, I remember reading it and just seeing the words death, winter, um, all those kind of words like trees, blackness, just very gothic, morbid sort of writing, and it really opened something up in me, because at that point I had not written anything for at least 6 years. When I was in high school, I was extremely unhappy. So the little bits of writing that I'd done as a kid, I really didn't do any creative writing almost at all through high school. I did plenty of reading, but definitely didn't do a lot of writing. I'd sort of lost my way with it a bit, was just very unhappy in life and just wasn't sure. Well, no, I was sure that I wanted to be a writer, I always knew that, but I just hadn't done any, and I was very unhappy with my life anyway. So then I remember the task we were set in class. She said we had to write a poem, and bearing in mind I hadn't written anything for quite a number of years, but I was very, very excited to do something creative for once, because before that, and even through high school, all it had ever been is essay, 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 and it was just so monotonously boring, and that's an overstatement. The lack of creativity that was being bestowed on us is just nothing short of tragic. So when we were told, oh, you've got to pair up and then you're going to write a poem, I essentially paired up, and maybe this wasn't great, but because I'm so used to doing the work for everybody, as happened in high school, everyone was quite happy to just let me do the work in a group task. I kind of sort of bulldozed the poem a little bit and basically wrote it and then just accredited it to both of us. But it really was just my creation. Um, and then I remember the response by my English teacher who didn't like me at all in sixth form, just went, bit weird. And that was that, which is a really odd response for a teacher, but there you go, she didn't like me anyway. But yeah, so that was my introduction to Sylvia Plath. And then I left. And after that, I really just kept reading her work, and over the years, I have researched into her greatly, and as of now, know pretty much so many things about her. There's biographies I've read. The Red Comet biography by Heather Clark um is an amazing biography that's just full of detail. I read the Bell Jar probably 7 years ago, I think. Well, yeah, probably about that time. Um, the Bell Jar, obviously I love, but I have a real soft spot for her poetry. And I think her influence on the literary world is not to be understated. I mean, her poems are quoted and she is just referenced herself in so much media. Gilmore Girls, she's mentioned. Um, there are plenty things that mention her. It's natural. I mean, that's what happens to a lot of poets, but she really made a name for herself. But the sad thing is that I always find those with the most exquisite writing seem to only find fame after their death, because when she was alive, there was no traction for her. She was very much, unfortunately, in Ted's shadow, and we know how I feel about Ted Hughes. Don't get me wrong, he was a great writer. I'll give him that. But what he did to Sylvia and how he treated Sylvia, and Assia for that matter, and Shara, is certainly something to demonish. Not demonish, admonish, sorry. Especially, particularly, I always say this to people, if you want to really understand the kind of person, the kind of man, if you can call him that, Ted Hughes was, read his letters. The way he manipulates situations and people in those letters is really just something to behold. Upon Sylvia's death, he wrote to Aurelia, and I am paraphrasing here, but this is basically what he said, was essentially he said he was sure that if she came over to see the children, being Prida Hughes and Nicholas Hughes, that he would be sure she would not pour her grief over the children, even though this is a woman who has just lost her daughter at 30 by suicide. It was just. And then also, as we know, he fiddled with Sylvia's manuscript and changed and picked things out when she didn't even want that at all. She wanted it as she had left it. the the way that man continued to martyr himself throughout the rest of his life. I mean, he took so many people to court over different things to do with Sylvia. Just the way, the lack of accountability for his behaviour and the insistence of putting blame on everybody else apart from himself is just baffling. And then this insistence that Sylvia was lying or she's exaggerating. She may have had her mental health problems, but that does not dismiss anything that she said, and not in her journals as well. It's just very odd. But that's why I always say to people, read the letters, read his compiled letters, and you will really see him for what he was. Like I said, I'll give him credit, great writer, but that's all I'll give him credit for. And, Sylvia wasn't perfect, absolutely not. I mean, we can speak about all days, of course, the um racism in her poetry, which I always acknowledge, as much as I love her as a writer, we have to acknowledge the bad sides and things she's done wrong. Certainly not perfect, was quite cutting in some of her comments about other women, about just people in general. I'm not sure. I mean, in terms of talking about art, we definitely would have got along, but in terms of person to person, I'm not entirely sure she would have been for me, even though I admire so much her work and what she did for poetry. But with Sylvia, the way it was her use of language and unusual metaphors and similes that I think really struck a chord with me. And that's why for this I really want to just go through excerpts from some of her poems so we can actually take a look at what she gave us. Now, there are some of the poems that actually don't get looked at as much. Early on in the complete collection, for example, Winter Landscape with Rooks is often overlooked, I guess. So it begins with water in the mill race through a sluice of stone plunges headlong into that black pond where, absurd and out of season, a single swan floats chasté as snow, taunting the clouded mind, which hungers to hold the white reflection down. I mean, as you say the words, it wraps around your tongue. It just rolls off the tongue. The sound is there. It's very musical, which is what she's always said she wanted to be. The last bit here, taunting the clouded mind, which hungers to haul the white reflection down. It's very, these strong musical beats. And then actually, aside from the musicality, you've got just interesting words that are dispersed throughout, a sluice of stone, which is not it's not an uncommon word, but it's very poignant when put within the other words there that I think is the point really. But taunting the clouded mind, is a particularly I think, excellent line or excerpt. But then there are things that says in the second paragraph, which I believe are that this is what makes her, I think, stand out. So she says, the austere sun descends above the fen, an orange cyclops eye, scorning to look longer on this landscape of chagrin. Now, orange cyclops eye, it's just so. She was, of course, like Ted, very interested in Greek mythology, just mythology in general, folklore. They were very much to the occult. So, orange cyclops eye is definitely fitting for her interests. But it's the way you can see that, being that the sun is described as an orange cyclops eye, you know, a cyclops just having one eye, and you can see that sun in the sky. The image it paints is really vivid. And in some of her other poems, I mean, she does reuse imagery in some of her other poems. For example, in Bucolics, she says below, a fen where water stood. So the fen makes an appearance again. Well, that is only natural, and I find that happens with myself when I'm writing poetry, is that sometimes images will repeat themselves, but they're in different ways in every time. But I think Sylvia's story is probably one of the most interesting literary stories there is. I mean, I will read absolutely any book on her. I read um articles on her, academic articles on her, anything I can get my hands on to do with Plath, I will read. And actually, sort of, I mean, it's not unknown, but I guess some people haven't read this yet. And to be fair, I only read this in January, which is Sylvia Plath and Devon, A Year's Turning, by Elizabeth Sigmund and Gail Crowther. And it just focuses on that last period of her life, which was spent in Devon just before she went um and bought the Yates house on Fitzroy Road. It deals with the culmination of Ted leaving and abandoning them, and sort of before that of when they got there. And Elizabeth Sigmund was a friend of Plath. Like, for example, it says here, Elizabeth recalls Plath as being an affectionate mother and one who took parenthood seriously. She remembers one particular visit from Sylvia when sitting at the dinner table with Nicholas on her knee. Sylvia laughed about how greedy Nicholas could be. As Elizabeth served up the food, Nicholas followed the dishes with his eyes, and Sylvia's exclaimed, "Look at him, look at his greedy eyes," and gave him a tight hug. Now, these are like little tidbits that you don't really get to know very often about Sylvia. I don't, I suppose people don't realize just what kind of person she was. And I think it gives a well-roundedness to the woman that she actually was without Sylvia's own self-deprecation, and also without the bias of Ted himself. It's a very nice middle ground, sort of unadulterated look at what she was like then. but if we go to Red Comet by Heather Clark, I mean, first of all, almost 1,000 pages. It's certainly an absolutely stunning work of biography. So much research has gone into this, clearly. And actually, when I find myself in a writer's block, I will often return to this. Okay, I don't normally do this on the podcast, and I really am sorry, but I need to take a drink. So bear with me. Yeah, so clearly a lot of research has gone into this. And there's just so much thorough detail. Some she says, she felt she had trouble making friends because of the bell jar. Hughes had predicted that Ariel would have a difficult time coming to terms with Sylvia's portrayal of her in the novel. In the late 80s, he wrote the painful dynamic between mother and daughter in his trial sequence. Surely you were unjust to your mother. Surely she has never found or suspected one fault in her care, in her anguish, over protecting you. See, Ted again. That Ted. But this exploration of my experience with Plath has been really pivotal because throughout all these years I have just wanted to be as great as she was. I had a dream was it last year, or was it no, it was the beginning of the year. And I remember it was to do with like there was this party or literary party at somewhere. And I saw this man and he gave me copies of the pink Smith memorandum paper that she wrote on. He gave me copies of them and he says to me, talent like that transfers, my love, implying that my talent will transfer somehow. And something to do with my symbiosis with Sylvia in the dream, which I just found a really interesting dream because I think it came out of nowhere as well. It's not as though I'd been reading up on her the night before. I think it was just a really peculiar, particular dream at the time, and I always write my dreams down. But I always remember that one in particular because it was such a unique kind of one. And even now, it's if you read my poetry, you will see the influence that she has had on me in terms of, the way I use unusual metaphors, unusual descriptions. The dark imagery has always been there, that's just always been me, to the point that it's become a running joke in the family. I'm always writing in the dark about death and stuff, and everybody wants me to write happy things, but that's just not me. I've always written about the dark side of things. I've always enjoyed the Gothic. Since I was a kid, growing up, I used to do like witches spells. I've collected crystals. I enjoy the crystals and the properties. I have tarot cards. I'm very much into mysticism, the paranormal, everything basically Sylvia and Ted were into really is what I'm into, and this was before I even knew about Sylvia. I've always been into mysticism and stuff like that. But I think there are just certain authors that have a profound impact on a writer. There will be particular ones for particular people, but Sylvia was the first one that I'd seen that was really writing about the unhappiness and discussions of death. And just immediately when I saw that and I read that in sixth form, I was just immediately I felt understood. I'd been so insulated for my whole life, like no one's ever really understood me. Still people don't now. Always been in my room, just sort of done my own thing because people just don't get me, and I don't find people very often who I just click with them. So it was nice to finally sort of see something reflected that I felt needed to be said. And going back to her poems, I mean, there are so many of these that I just absolutely love. For example, Faun here. Haunched like a fawn, he hewed from grove of moon glint and fen frost, until all owls in the twigged forest flapped black to look and brood on the call this man made. No sound but a drunken coot, lurching home along river bank. Stars hung water sunk, so a rank of double star eyes lit boughs where those owls sat. And that's just the two stanzas. I mean, just so many of these great, great lines. And then, of course, the bell jar, which was semi autobiographical about her time at Mademoiselle magazine, which really did a lot for. Because I think it gets, apart from. I mean, this isn't about aside from the valid criticisms of the um racist portrayals in there, the criticisms about it being unoriginal are a little odd because, of course, now novels such as The Bell Jar are very commonplace. There are a lot of novels that deal with stuff like that and similar themes. But at the time, it was, very different. And I think you have to look at that through that lens. So, to wrap up this episode, I thought I would read an entry from my journal. I'm just trying to find one because the one that I just wrote last night has ideas for a project which I don't want to give out. Let's see. Why not? So I was writing about we used to have a caravan in Conway in North Wales, and I used to spend many childhood summers in Conway and Llandudno. I have a real fondness for that place, those places. So I was writing about sort of the memories. I'll just read a little excerpt here. So, Llandudno in North Wales is Britain's oldest traditional Punch and Judy show. The tall barber striped theatre provides a unique magic for children and their families. Watching this particular show is one of the many fond memories I have of childhood summers in Llandudno and Conway. In Wales, my imagination was at its peak. From imaginary horses on invisible reins to flying creatures, my inner world was a source of survival. The latter only ever present when my mother used a rosy arnica gel. On Conway Morpher Beach, I envisioned mermaids swimming in the plasticine blue. Away from the glass core that was school, I was living in a completely different world. There was just something so magical about Conway and Llandudno. And it's also where I saw the ghost of that witch, from which I told on the podcast a couple of episodes ago. But yeah, this has been the Maple Moon podcast. I'm your host, Courtney. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I shall see you in the next one. Goodbye.